Nights have a voice of their own. They keep time by the hum of machines and the slow sweep of a clock hand, by the thin light that leaks from a window and the single chair that holds whatever loneliness is left on shift. If you work nights long enough, you learn to listen for what doesn't belong. If you're watching this all the way through, stay with me. Subscribe, like, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. There's more at the end, and I want to hear your night shift stories too. I worked the graveyard at the corner store because rent didn't wait for daylight. My name is Alex. I was 23 then, and I covered the 3 to 7 shift because barista tips dried up and my sister's car payment had to be made. The store was a converted house, linoleum, a beaten counter, the cooler doors that stuck in winter. My routine was small and exact. Sweep the entrance, check the expiry dates on milk, rotate the cigarettes display, microwave a frozen burrito at 4:30. The fluorescent lights buzzed like a distant argument, and the clock above the register never seemed to move. The first odd thing was the footsteps. Not the customer's clumsy shoes on gravel behind the dumpsters, but a soft, steady tread by the window at the front. 3 slow steps and a pause, over and over, like someone walking a small circle of the sidewalk outside and stopping only to look in. I saw the shadow through the glass before I felt the chill, a presence against the street lamp that made the window seem like a screen. When there were customers, I told myself it was hooded teenagers checking a lottery. When the footfalls kept time with my favorite soap opera on the tiny TV by the register, an old telenovela we left playing for company, I started to notice more. On the 3rd night, the TV turned itself to full volume when no one else was in the store. I was in the back, stocking energy drinks, when the living room scene burst from the speakers. I heard a woman call a name I didn't recognize, and then the static snapped. I hurried out, heart trying to find a rhythm under the fluorescent hum. The TV was at normal volume when I flicked the channel back, but the power strip was cool under my hand. No surges, no tripped breaker. The cooler doors steamed faintly in the cold, and my breath came out like a lullaby. I started checking the security footage when I could. The cameras were grainy, the kind that made every night look older than it was. At 3:12 a.m. on the footage, a figure walked up to the window, stopped, and raised a hand to the glass. The timestamp trembled, then the figure was gone. My stomach tightened. I replayed the clip until the pixels bled meaning into the shape of a woman with a scarf and an old coat, looking at the store like it had been her own for years. There was a chair visible on the sidewalk from a certain angle, an old metal chair someone had left, and on the footage, the scarf brushed it as if she had leaned to rest. The manager, Mr. If you walked past room 214 at 3 in the morning, you'd hear the television even when the door was closed, a soap opera's laughter leaking out into the linoleum. Routine for me meant rounds at 2, charting at 3, a quick cup of coffee at 4:15, and then the slow watch of patients who slept badly when the world was quiet. The first odd thing was the chair. There was one wooden rocker in room 214 that had a habit of being in a different position in the morning than it had been at night. I checked the door, tick off the vitals, and noticed the rocker angled toward the window like someone had been sitting there watching the street, even when there had been no visitor listed. The monitors hummed, the clock by the bed read 3:07 and refused to hurry. Once, I found a small knitted cap on the armrest of that chair that hadn't been there when I signed the chart. It was tiny, preemie-sized, soft with a faint note of lavender. I asked the charge nurse, who shrugged and said, "Patients' families leave all sorts of things. We bag them if they're not claimed." But there were no babies in 214. The patient in that room had been a man who'd passed months earlier, a retired seamstress whose name the record showed had been Mrs. Alvarez. He wasn't supposed to be there. The bed was empty, a neat sheet folded like a closed hand. The audio anomaly started as a whisper. The television I'd switched off a half hour before would be playing again, quiet under the hum of the air conditioning. Other nurses blamed faulty remotes or phantom channels.
I began to think of scheduled programs, soap operas my grandmother used to watch, something that made the white noise of grief feel less like an accusation and more like company. The escalation came one night when the storm took the city hard and the old wing took on the taste of rain and old plaster. Power flickers were common in storms. The backup generators chugged like old men grumbling. At 2:53, the lights dipped and the television in 2:14 flashed on with the scene of a mother holding a child. The picture was bright for a moment, then the monitors chimed like a soft reprimand. I went in with the clipboard and the flashlight, the beam making the dust look like floating islands. The patient listed as Mr. Rios had no chart notes for that night. Someone had moved the file earlier, and the discharge had been recorded as completed. But on the bed, the pillow still pressed in a shape like someone had just stood up. As I sat in the rocker, because sometimes you do things without thinking when you want to check if your hands are steady enough to hold grief, I felt a presence at the window. It wasn't the creak of the building. It was a small inhalation, the feeling of a breath across the back of my neck that smelled faintly of talc and milk. My phone vibrated in my pocket with nothing but static. A lullaby played, no source in the room, and the tiny cap I had found weeks before had been placed on the foot of the bed.
For a moment, my training and the long lists of protocol halted, and something older rose. The knowledge that some beds are markers for unfinished histories. I asked around in the records room a week later because that night stayed like a stone caught in my shoe. The clerk found a note in an old log. A nurse named Mariana had kept vigil in 214 decades ago. She had been known for staying overnight with lonely patients, knitting caps, and bringing a radio for company. The obituary had a line about a woman who never missed the late train, and then faded to the small print of a simple life. No one seemed to remember her face, except in the way that people remember the sound of rain on a certain roof. The climactic night was the one a trainee described later, when a man tried to force his way into 214. The man had been agitated, speaking to himself about paperwork and benefits, hands shaking like someone who'd lived with a pressure cooker in his chest. He rattled the latch and demanded to speak to the nurse on duty. I was passing by the corridor when the trainee's voice came tight over the radio. I moved fast because that is what duty does. You move as if the body's reflexes know the shape of danger before your thoughts do. When I reached the door, the handle turned and stopped. The man shoved and pushed again, more forceful. The rocker in 214 began to move on its own, a slow, resolute rocking that filled the doorway's narrow angle in a way that made the man slap his palm against his mouth and step backward as if startled by an unseen presence. He left a trail of rain inside his jacket, but he left, and the hallway settled into a damp silence. No one touched him as he walked off. His retreat was as sudden as a thought leaving a sentence. Afterward, I sat in the rocker until the dawn moved like pale pencil marks across the floor. I held the cap and folded it into my pocket. I told myself I had imagined the breath, the music. But then an orderly came by with a small bag of things, old letters and a handkerchief, and said the family had never collected them. He looked at the window and then at me and simply said, "She likes the daytime better, but she keeps a watch." I began to bring a small lamp for the chair and a warm cup of coffee to the room on long, slow nights. Sometimes, when the ward was quieter than a closed book, I'd find the lamp turned to face out the window and the cup cooled to the exact temperature a person might leave it if they'd planned to return. The presence in room 214 never tried to frighten me. It seemed to measure things in care. Even when visitors were short and angry and grief came in the form of slammed doors, the rocker moved on. I left that job 2 years later when my son's school moved and I couldn't afford the commute. Packing up my locker, a linen square slipped from a folder and brushed my hand. Someone had folded it into a small heart. The last image I have is the wooden rocker angled toward the window and a sliver of light on the clock as it swung past 4. I said a small, foolish thing aloud, a promise that if I came back late, I would bring a warmer blanket. I never saw Mariana, but sometimes at 3 in the morning, when my phone buzzes and the city's lights are a distant sea, I hear an old soap opera tune and think of the way some nights keep watch. That was what happened to Elena. Later, in a research library that closed at midnight, a man named Marcus told a story about a photograph that didn't like to be looked at. I am Marcus, 29, and I worked nights at the city archive because the pay was steady and the silence felt safer than the noise from my mother's apartment. The archive was a converted two-story schoolhouse with a basement that smelled like dust and old paper. My shift was 12 to 7, fog light through the tall windows, the clock on the landing that always ran 3 minutes slow. My job was to digitize, to migrate the fragile margins of memory into hard drives and private servers for historians who liked to comb through names. The place hummed with machines that made the air feel mechanical and quiet. On my second week, I noticed an old photograph tucked behind a box of 1940s property deeds. The black and white image showed a woman on a stoop by a storefront, a chair beside her, and a child off to the side playing with a tin car. Someone had annotated the back in a spidery hand. Esperanza, watch the corner, 1952. I carried the photo by the corner of the cardboard and set it under the desk lamp like it was something living. When I walked to the window to stamp a batch of records, it felt like the air had a certain holding, like someone had invited patience to sit down and wait. The first anomaly was the radio. I kept a small transistor by my workstation because work needs a human voice. It mostly played classical music that sounded like falling glass. One night it clicked to static, and then a faint voice hummed through. A soap opera line in Spanish, the cadence slow and wrapped in a room that wasn't mine. I traced the cord and the battery, nothing. The sound slipped into the stacks like water and settled. I told myself archival floors carry memory. The place is a mouth that keeps rhythm. But the photograph seemed to brighten under the lamp that night, the woman's smile clearer than before. I began to notice the chair motif. Chairs appeared in the corners of images, chairs left outside of doorways in present day, chairs tucked in alleyways like small altars. A researcher from the Historical Society stopped by with an inquiry about urban fixtures and mentioned casually that there had once been a woman who always left a chair outside a store to keep watch. Her name, Esperanza, came up again like a stitch in the fabric of the city's nighttime. Things escalated when a neighboring building underwent demolition. The heavy machinery thudded and the ground worked like an animal in the day. But at night, the noises receded and left the archive like a sleepwalker. One night, the power hiccuped as if someone had breathed on the breaker box. The scanner flashed, the monitors blinked, and then one by one, the images on the screens rearranged themselves. Frames from the old photograph appeared on every monitor, magnified and grainy, as if the digits had decided to make room for a face. My pulse jumped. I swore aloud and reached to reboot the system, fingers slippery with cold from the AC. I decided to research the woman in the photograph because archivists are cursed with curiosity. The obituary was a small column in a paper microfilm reel. Esperanza Rivera, died at 82, no known relatives, beloved figure of the neighborhood. I read aloud, the printed columns like a litany. Under the microfilm, someone had left a single-pressed daisy, brittle and golden. I carried the daisy back to the photograph and placed it in the margin like a bookmark. The climactic incident happened just after 2 when I left to fetch more storage media and the front door, which should have been locked, was ajar. I remember the exact sound, a chair shifting, that small scraping across wood that made my chest tighten. I moved toward the light by the window and found the folding chair from the break room outside in the hallway, turned to face the stairwell as if set there to watch any who might come. The photograph in the lamp's glow lay on the desk,
And when I looked up, there was a faint imprint on the window, an outline of a hand, nothing written, just the shape of someone who had leaned to see. The air smelled like wet earth and laundry soap. I felt, absurdly, as though a person had come to see if the work of remembering was being done carefully. I asked an old neighbor who sometimes volunteered at the archive if people had put chairs out as a kind of neighborhood bench. He said, no, it's not about benches. It's about keeping watch. She used to sit and fold the world into a smaller space so it didn't wander away. He told me a story about a man who once tried to harass a woman late at night and found his path blocked by a cluster of chairs left in the street. Not chairs like a barricade, he said slowly, but chairs like a meeting. She certainly knew how to make company out of silence. My investigation was small and modest. I left a folded crocheted square near the photographed once, a small act of company, like leaving a cup of coffee at an altar. That night, the scanner woke to the sound of pages turning, though no one had touched it. The chair in the hallway had shifted to face the window. The photograph's woman's smile seemed softer, her watchfulness less like accusation and more like guardianship. I began, stupidly, to feel a little less alone in the long hours. The archive hum became a kind of conversation. Sometimes late nights demand a witness.
I became that witness by accident, by leaving a lamp on near the photograph, by keeping the radio low but present, by not shoving the chair back into the closet as the janitor asked me to. People started to drop off small things, a pressed flower, a postcard, once a child's drawing of a woman with a large smile and a chair beside her. Whoever found them called them offerings or thanks. I didn't claim the title of believer. I claimed the title of someone who knew what it was to dread leaving a place alone, and then to find, unexpectedly, that someone else had done the watching you couldn't afford to do. The night I quit, 2 years after I started, the daisy was gone from the microfilm tray. In its place was a coin, old and smooth. I slipped it into my pocket and, for once, didn't turn on the light before I closed up. I left the photograph under the lamp and the chair facing the window. Outside, the streetlight hummed and a few cars drifted past, the city breathing in its sleep. On my way, a janitor waved without looking up. For all the years I had spent cataloging the city's names, there was still one I kept thinking of when it was quiet: Esperanza. Sometimes people are more than obituaries. Sometimes they are a promise. That was what happened at the archive. Later, in a nursing home that smelled of citron and distant afternoon, a veteran nurse named Rosa told a story about a patient who refused to be moved. My name is Rosa, I'm 47, and I had been on nights in long-term care for 19 years when I met the resident who seemed determined not to leave his room. He was quiet, a thin man with a patched cardigan and a watch that had stopped at 2:15, the time his daughter said he'd first complained about the cold. My shifts were a testament to small chores: changing linens, checking meds, making sure someone had water before their throat dried to the point of complaint. The facility was old, the windows creaked, the radiators hissed like sleeping animals, and the corridors carried the sound of a television or a radio like a faint heartbeat. The anomalies began as simple displacements. A slipper would be on the wrong side of the bed. The bedside lamp would face the door instead of the armchair, as if whoever had used the chair had turned it to watch someone walk in. The resident, Mr. Abbott, would complain sometimes that something was sitting on the end of his bed at night. He didn't sound scared. He sounded as if he had become used to the idea of company that didn't require a chair. He'd say, "She keeps the drafts out," and I would nod, because part of nursing is listening to explanations that make sense to the sick. One night, a new aide, someone with hands steady but eyes that darted, reported hearing footsteps in the hall at 4 a.m. He said he'd seen a woman in a faded dress glide past the nurse's station as if delivering messages. I checked the cameras. The footage showed only the flare of a street light across the linoleum and an empty hallway. And then, in the footage's grain, a shadow at the window that seemed to lift a hand like a blessing. It wasn't clear. Camera angles in old buildings are forgiving of the imagination. But Mr. Abbott smiled when I mentioned it and patted the side of his blanket like someone returning to an old conversation. The escalation involved a man in a hurry, an estranged relative who came one night to sort things out and made a scene about linens and legalities. He argued loudly in the corridor with a social worker about what could be taken and what belonged to the man. The tone of the shouting made residents wake, heads bobbing like ships. As the argument escalated, the door to Mr. Abbott's room that had been locked on the inside, by habit, by elders' needs, clanged open on its own, and the armchair by the bed slid to block the doorway, a simple, solid thing that made the man stop mid-sentence. He pushed the chair back, and the chair slid forward again as if someone had steadied it with a hand. The man left angry and muttering. No one saw who rearranged the furniture. The aide swore the chair had moved without anyone touching it. Afterward, the staff held a brief meeting and agreed to be more careful. The man never returned. Mr. Abbott's breathing steadied. Sometimes protection doesn't have to shout its presence. A chair that won't be shoved is loud enough. I had been skeptical once. Years of nights teach you how to weigh evidence. A loose board, a shifting draft, a dropped pill bottle. But when small, consistent things accumulate like a pattern, they change the shape of your disbelief into something else. For me, it became a responsibility. I would find myself at odd hours making a small cup of tea and setting it on the bedside table for no one who would drink it, but for the ritual of leaving heat where there had been none. Sometimes, when the hallway was thin with air, I'd return to the room and the cup would be empty, the steam long gone. The aftercare we offered was practical: better locks, a policy for family disputes, a chart note for any visitor. But there was another kind of care I started to practice: leaving a clean blanket folded at the foot of the bed, walking the corridor twice to check the windows were latched, making sure the television faced the chair in the corner. If there was a watchful person in the hall or by the window, I wanted to acknowledge them with small courtesies. In that way, compassion became a kind of warding, not against ghosts, but against neglect. One night, when winter had hardened the panes into fragile glass, I found the little handkerchief Mr. Abbott used to freshen his brow folded across the arm of the chair. The room smelled faintly of citrus and something older, rose soap perhaps, like a memory someone had taken time to keep. Mr. Abbott reached out and smoothed the handkerchief, then looked at me and said, "She liked to keep the windows clean. She liked to see who passed by." I thought of the chairs that shift guard a doorway, of the way places take on stories and keep them. I retired a few years later from long-term nights. Before I left, I made sure every bedside had a small blanket and a laminated note reminding staff to check the window latches twice each shift. Small bureaucratic things, but they matter. Sometimes when I am out buying milk at night, I find myself looking for chairs left by doorways, for windows that seem to be kept like eyes. That is how a night worker carries memory, in habits and in the small things we leave behind. That was what happened to Rosa. Later, a young paramedic who rode the late calls told of a house where the television stayed on for no reason, and a child's laugh came from the attic, though the family claimed no children lived there. My name is Jonah. I'm 26 and I rode the night ambulance because the night differential paid off student loans and the city sleeps differently when you're awake. Emergency runs are a rhythm of adrenaline and paperwork. The siren sounds less like warning and more like punctuation to our conversations. The calls that stick in your throat are never the obvious ones, the crashes or the synthesis of violence, but the quiet ones. It's just me, people say, into a phone line, and you know they mean loneliness as much as illness. The night we were called to the Victorian on Elm, the caller said the television wouldn't turn off and there were noises in the attic. The house had a history of odd things.
Neighbors reported glimpses of a woman on the porch in the late hours and a child sometimes seen playing with an invisible friend under the streetlight. The family that answered the door looked tired and oddly apologetic, like people embarrassed to hold a house that was not behaving itself. The baseline was ordinary. There were boxes stacked in the living room from an uncompleted move, the smell of old detergent, and a clock on the mantel that ticked 3 minutes slow. The young woman who had called us kept repeating that the television was stuck on a channel from her childhood, and that she woke hearing a lullaby even when the speakers were off. My partner Lewis joked about a stuck remote and said we'd check the wiring and call an electrician. Inside, the TV screen showed a cartoon image of a mother and child in sepia, looping without skipping. When we turned the power strip off and back on, the screen flashed to black and then, a beat later, back to the same frame. The speakers were cold when we touched them. What made the alarm spike wasn't equipment failure. It was the laugh. Upstairs, from the attic, came a small, bright laugh like a bell. It could have been a raccoon, a loose shutter. There are rational things to explain most sounds.
But the laugh had rhythm and recognition and the kind of familiarity you only get from a voice that knows your name. We climbed the narrow stairs, flashlights nodding like ship's lamps, and found the attic door closed, though we had not seen anyone climb up. The boards creaked underfoot, and the dust motes moved like small, slow planets in the torchlight. We found toys, old wooden cars, a rag doll with eyes faded to the color of newspaper, arranged as if someone had just set them down to fetch a snack. The attic window was half open. The night air moved the strings of a sun-faded curtain. There's a thing that happens to professionals in close quarters. You register every possibility and then discard them all one by one until there's a residue that remains. The toys were clean and placed with intention. Someone had been playing and then stopped. The laugh came again, but softer, as if someone were behind the curtain. The family remembered a child named Tomas who had died decades before. They had pictures in a frame downstairs, a black and white one with a boy and a dog. The obituary was small, wrapped in a collage of old street photos. Someone had left a note at the shelter where the family once sought help. Tomas loved the attic. Please look after him. The words felt like instruction. The climax was not violent. It was an everyday miracle that looked like kindness. A man from the neighborhood, who had once been thought a loner, had been seen leaving small wooden toys on the porch under the silver maple. When the man came by one night to look for assistance, he was frail, voice like paper. He said he'd heard something scratching at his window. He left with a toy in his jacket, and days later he was found sitting on the porch, playing with a small car as if he had been waiting for company. The childlike presence seemed to call to the city's gentle people and collect them like moths to a porch light. For me, the aftermath was a choice. We can't always do the right thing, but we can do the kind thing. The family asked if we could check the wiring and make sure the ladder to the attic was safe. We did that and more. We left a small lamp in the attic and a basket with a knitted cap and a cup of cocoa the next night that I personally bought. The television continued to play its looping scenes sometimes, but if the lamp was on, the screen would flicker and settle. I don't claim to fix anything. I only know that when you offer a space warmth, sometimes the room stops trying to speak in the only way it can. I kept a small wooden car back at the station, tucked into my locker. Some nights when the calls were quiet, I'd take it out and turn it in the palm of my hand and think of the way small things gather people. The city keeps its ghosts, but sometimes the ghosts keep the city too, reminding us to leave a light on for someone who once kept theirs. That was what happened on Elm Street. The last story someone told me before dawn, and before the sky began to empty into a pale promise, was about a store clerk who never quite escaped his own second sight. I am Daniel. I worked nights at a 24/7 pharmacy as a technician because the shift differential meant being able to see my son on weekends. Pharmacies at night are fluorescent islands in a sleeping city. Shelves of medicine like a private language, the click of a computer, the steady beep of the label printer. People who visit at 3 in the morning are often people carrying weight, a cough that won't quit, a bag of cash for pills that fix memory, a heart that remembers names it shouldn't. My work is small and precise. My duty is to be the calm face in the aisle when someone needs a kind word. The anomaly at first was a scent, a particular cologne that smelled like orange peels and talc. It found me when the automatic door sighed, and a solitary figure would appear in the doorway and then step away as if worried about letting the draft in. The camera showed nothing in the doorway. It was as if the smell existed to make a person who wasn't there feel like family. Then the phone would ring in the back room, one ring only, and on the line there would be nothing but the distant static of a television. The intercom would click on for a second, too short for any message. I got used to leaving the kettle on low so a pot of water would be warm when a customer came in. It was a ritual as much as a convenience. One night the escalation happened when a man ran into the store with a mug of blood on his hands. He'd cut his palm on broken glass outside near the alley. He was frightened, breath coming fast, and people in the street had started to gather. I called the ambulance and wrapped his hand. He sat on the stool by the counter and kept insisting someone had been following him. He kept looking toward the window with a frantic, pleading air. Later, the man refused to press charges or even give a full statement. He muttered thanks and left with the watch he'd lost earlier tucked in his pocket. I locked the door and sat with the kettle until it hissed. Days later, the same man returned and stood looking into the display case. He tapped the glass as if asking permission to look. She sat there once, he told me, as if continuing a previous conversation, pointing at a small dent in the molding. She kept an eye on the street, kept an eye on the children. The word she kept appearing in the way people spoke around me, a pronoun that carried a name without being said. One late shift, a group of kids tried to break into the delivery van behind the store. I saw them on the cameras, hands clumsy at the lock. I thought of calling the cops, but the thought of hassle and paperwork and daylight courts made me hesitate. The woman in the window, if she existed, moved, and the kids dropped their tools as if they'd grazed a live wire. A scrape of metal sounded, and then a bicycle bell rang somewhere far down the street. The kids ran. I did call the police later, and they found nothing obvious. Only a set of footprints that led to the curb and dissolved into the night's rain. After that, people in the neighborhood started leaving small things on the stoop. A cup of coffee, a wrapped sandwich, sometimes a child's cap. The store became, in a small way, a place to leave a circle of care for whatever sat at the window. I added a sign inside the glass. If you need help, knock. It felt silly, but sometimes you have to scaffold the world where the scaffolding is invisible. I learned to accept that some nights bring visitors that don't sign in. I learned to watch for hands at the window and for chairs that refuse to be cleared away. In the months when my son was ill and I couldn't be present at every hour, leaving a lamp on in the store at night felt like leaving a window open in my own life for him to see. The thing that unsettled me most wasn't the presence, but the responsibility it implied. If a place can keep a watch, maybe we ought to keep ours too. When I transferred to a day shift, people told me that the stories quieted, that the window was less likely to have the silhouette of someone watching. But sometimes, on nights I'm unable to sleep, I walk by the old corner and look in. The chair sits just so. The light is low. The window holds a faint handprint that the sun cannot fully burn away. I imagine a woman folding the city's stories in a corner and smiling like someone who has kept a promise. You can call these things ghosts or memories or the city's way of keeping its own. Call them what you like. What matters is that night work teaches you a thing about obligation. When the world is sleeping, someone or something keeps watch.
Whether it is human or not, the watch matters because it changes the way people act. People who worry that someone is watching often behave better than those who think no one sees. If you've made it this far, you're probably a night person or someone who likes to listen when the city is quiet. These stories share a pattern, a routine, a small oddity, a choice. To leave a light on, to set a cup of coffee, to sit through a watch, and then a consequence that is sometimes tender, sometimes unsettling. The common thread isn't always supernatural. It's the human response to abandonment. If any of these accounts stirred something in you, an unease, a memory, a story you keep folded in your own pocket, share it below. Tell us where you were working and what you saw. If you're on a night shift right now, maybe leave a light on for someone who can't afford to be alone. And if you're new here, consider subscribing for more true-feeling night shift testimonies. If these stories unsettled you, like the video, share it, and if you have your own midnight memory, tell us in the comments. Sometimes the smallest accounts stitch together the largest comforts.
I'll be listening to what you say. People started finding small ways to speak back. At first, it was in objects, an extra pair of gloves tucked under the mat, a thermos left at the base of the step, a dog leash abandoned for a few hours and then retrieved. Then it moved into handwriting, short, awkward lines on torn receipts. "Thanks for keeping the light," read one, scrawled in a looping hand and pinned to the inside of the glass with a bent paper clip. Another said, "She saved my bike once." A child drew a crooked house and wrote in crayon, "For the watcher." Those notes became a map of the neighborhood's private debts. People who would never have crossed the threshold to ask for help found a way to say, in the smallest of gestures, that someone had kept an eye on them. The stoop changed from a place to pass through to a place to stop and leave a thing that mattered, the sort of offering you give to a watchful thing you believe has been watching you. Sometimes the offerings were practical. A woman who worked the late cleaning shift at the hospital left a thermos of soup and a note, "For long hours." A kid who mended bicycles down on Halden Street left a set of spare nuts and bolts taped together with masking tape and a child's apology. "Sorry about the noise, fellas." A couple who had been sleeping in a car left a small folded blanket one winter morning and circled the chair with the kind of care that reads like a blessing. The man with the watch came back once more. He lingered longer that time, spoke to the glass as if to an old friend. "She used to have a laugh like a bell," he said. "Not loud, just right. Sounds like someone opening a window." He told me, slowly, each syllable measured, that his mother used to sit at a chair with the same slant in her house in a different neighborhood. She had kept watch for the children who learned to cross the street without a hand to hold. After she died, he kept finding pennies in his pockets and a sense that he should be kinder than the day allowed. He had found the watch on a bench block away from the corner months earlier and had come back to make sure it was where it belonged. He did not press the matter of ghosts. He only wanted to make sure the chair in my window had not been forgotten. There were nights when the city hummed and there was no handprint to be found, only the ordinary residue of business, red gum on the pavement, cigarette ash traced into gutters. But the habit of checking the glass had become mine. If the chair sat empty and the light was low, I still paused, as if a flick of the lampshade could prompt an answer. Some nights I left the sign up, sometimes I took it down. I learned that ritual can be both a shelter and a weight. We build small altars because the world feels too big to hold alone. One winter, when the hospital calls were fast and the hours thinner, my son finally began to breathe easier.
The day nurses told stories of progress in clipped phrases that felt like a kind of prayer. I started to shift shifts again so I could be in the day, to hold the quietness of ordinary mornings in my hands and not the long, flat hours of worry. The window felt the same and different. It had the memory of many nights folded into it now, as if the glass kept a faint fog of all those people who had paused there. People asked me if anything ever happened like in the stories. Full revelations, a face in the dark, a voice that spoke. The closest I could offer was a collection of small things that add up to meaning. A woman found an old photograph tucked behind a brick near the foundation of her porch. A man found his father's pen on the window ledge, ink still working. A boy stopped stealing and started leaving packages for the woman who watched. He left them unannounced, like an apology without witnesses. There is a peculiar moral geometry to places that watch. They don't demand confession, but they invite it. They don't mete out justice, but they make injustice harder to live with. People behaved differently when they believed, even for a little while, that they were being seen. Not by cameras or the law, but by something patient and patient-looking. They smoothed their language on the stoop. They picked up trash. They kept their dogs from barking all night. I cannot say whether the woman who haunted the corner, if she haunted it at all, kept the city safer. I can only say that our small domestic acts did. The neighbors who looked out for one another, the coffee left at night, the thermos of soup that made its rounds. The world was less indifferent because we made it so for one another. Sometimes people took comfort less from the idea of a watcher and more from the discovery that someone else had already decided to be kind. A month ago, I found a folded piece of paper taped to the inside of the glass. It had no salutation, no name, only one line written carefully in blue ink. Sometimes someone is keeping watch on you, too. Beneath it, someone had drawn a tiny heart. I left that paper there for a week. People stopped and read it and smiled. A teenager who used to loiter on the corner stopped by and, in halting words, told me about a night when a stranger had given him a blanket. He'd almost refused it, proud and stubborn, but something in the man's face convinced him to take it. He said he thought of that blanket when things were hard. It kept me warm, he said, as if that was the most sacred truth he knew. There are ways to measure healing that do not register on charts. A mother who had been terrified of walking home after dark now adjusted her child's mittens with the calm of someone who had learned to trust the light. A man whose temper used to flare in the alley now paused to pick up the litter left behind by others. The watch did not fix the city's problems. It simply made the small acts easier to do. I kept listening to the comments you left after the videos and the posts. People shared memories from long runs, from empty subway platforms, from lonely hospital wards. Some wrote about things that were plainly explainable. Some told stories that bent at the edges into that tender space between sorrow and wonder. I read them all, the cup of kindness, the scrap of a life, and stitched them into my own nights. Tonight, like many others, I boiled water and watched the kettle until it sighed. The chair by the window sat with the sun slanting across its arms. A gust of wind pressed an old receipt against the glass, and it fluttered like a pulse. I wiped the inside of the pane and found, faintly, the outline of a handprint that the sun could not fully erase. I turned off the light, left the door unlocked, and walked home with the small relief of someone who knows the city will, for at least a little while more, take someone into its keeping. If you are out there, with a night shift heart, a kettle, a cup left on a stoop, know that these small gestures are not invisible. They make a world that tolerates less cruelty and holds more of us up. If you have a story from the dark hours, tell it. If you are keeping watch in your own way, keep the light on. I will be listening.